The joke always was that the guy reads dirty magazines. A college guy would say, hey, he reads dirty magazines. And the image always was of uneducated people, men who were frustrated and whatnot, and you'd be wearing the long dirty raincoat with a hat, over his head, tucked down, and he'd go down to 199th Street and, in the corner and go in the dirty bookstore, because that's the only place you'd ever see something like that. And so that was the image of the guy who looked at naked pictures of naked ladies. Who else does that, We said little girls put away their paper dolls at age 10, and they're now supposed to grow up and not play with paper dolls anymore. So college guys wouldn't see themselves as lusting after paper dolls. They were way too educated for that sort of thing. Our World War II generation had completely broken from that kind of salacious conduct. I don't want to say everybody, but the generation as a generation had broken from that. They were focused on building a life for themselves and rebuilding their lives. One of the things people forget, who are not my age and older, is how traumatized the nation was post-World War II.
A date which will live in infamy.
That war exhausted and traumatized this country. This became a planting ground for a lot of what followed. 1948, Kinsey hits with his tome, his sexual revolution tome. The guys are barely coming home in 1946. They're staggering home from World War II. They're just starting to breathe when we get hit with that sexual revolutionary book by Kinsey. They called it the K-bomb, Kinsey's book, which revolutionizes Hefner. A revolution is what took place. A real revolution. Kinsey was officially at Indiana University a zoologist, and his specialty was this little teeny-weeny gall wasp. And what he does is he goes out with his young men, who are studying under him, and they go into the forest, and they have little nets, and they capture all these wee little tiny gall wasps, and they bring them back to the laboratory, and they label each one very meticulously, and its wingspan and so forth. Now this becomes rather important, because later, when Kinsey's talking about how you measure human sexuality, he said it shouldn't be any different than measuring gall wasps. The measurement of the wingspan, and it's this long and this wide, and I should be an expert in dealing with human sexuality as I am in dealing with gall wasps. So anyway, Kinsey begins attacking this issue, and he interviews women and men on campus. He takes them in privately and asks them private questions. Nobody knows what he asks. There was never a record that we were allowed to see. Nobody has any proof as to what their answers were. There was never any record, okay? But as a scientist, suddenly this kind of invalid collection of data, it's not even data, takes on the resilience of hard experimental science. Well, you can't do that. You can't secretly go off and ask people questions. You never tell them what your questions are, and you have no proof that the answers they gave you are the answers that you've written down, much less if you could figure it out. Yet this becomes the Bible of the field of human sexuality education and human sexuality and changing our laws. This is bizarre. Well, one of the first, the most shocking things is you look through his data and you're trying to see, and people criticized his data, and they did say that it, a lot of it wouldn't be accurate. They didn't criticize it properly, as thoroughly, of course, as they should have. But people in those years didn't think of scientists as deviants, and they just didn't. And so they didn't ever question him as a man. They believed the propaganda that they had been given. Now, pages 160 and 161, in which he describes the so-called orgasms that these tortured children are having, tell us we've got a problem here. Then when we move to take a look at the data that he was providing, the tables, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, in which children are being sexually molested around the clock, 24 hours at a time. You have a little boy who's 4 years old who has 26 orgasms in 24 hours. That is an around-the-clock experiment, a guinea pig experiment on some 4-year-old boy. Who's doing that? And who calls that science? That's the science that changed our society and that really has revolutionized the West in general. But when I read this, I said, okay, and I didn't know anything about Kinsey's personal life at the time. But knowing what it is to make love, as an adult person, I had 4 children, I thought, okay, whoever wrote this, the children have definite pleasure from being tortured, from fainting and having convulsions, from screaming and writhing in pain, and those were his words. Whoever wrote that has to be a sadomasochist and has got to be a sadomasochistic pedophile, because nobody else could write a thing like that. Amongst the elite, it was immediately a hot seller. The average person didn't really believe it. They were a little bit too cynical about that. But at the same time, you have to remember, the push was on. So what we had was a mass media blitz. It went everywhere. Now, the average person who knows about the world, they want their kids to be college educated, right? So their kids are now going to college. Now in college, they're all being taught that what Kinsey said is gospel truth. That the man who revolutionized sex for this country, the man who put sex education into our schools that reflected his sexual belief system, the man who helped change our laws and gut the laws that protected women and children, the man who helped bring us to a point where little girls are sending naked pictures of themselves across the internet. So this is the man who started the sexual revolution, a sexual psychopath. This is the man who said that children were sexual from birth, who talked about an orgasm for a little 2-month-old and a 5-month-old. So there's nothing that's traditional about this man. Nothing. This is not your average American guy. Yet the public perception of him, created by Indiana University and Rockefeller Foundation, in terms of all of their publicity, the public perception is, and I've got that in Life magazine, Look magazine, Time magazine, Collier's, every major magazine and every major newspaper, presents him to the public as just your average Republican, conservative kind of guy who goes to church and got the pictures of Clara Kinsey knitting and making persimmon pudding. You have to ask, why create this illusion? Why create this lie about this man and his wife and their family for the entire world? And that is because this man will become the single individual who will alter American sexual conduct up to the very present. One of the other major contributing factors, one of the things that really, I think, gave me a grasp of this issue was that one day it turned out that my daughter, who was 10 years old at the time, had been raped by the boy upstairs. When she said something to the boy, he commented to her, "No, no, no." He said, "I know that this is really okay. I've seen this in my father's magazines." And I said, what am I going to do? So I call my aunt, who I love dearly, in Maryland, upper middle class lady living in a lovely middle class environment, nothing radical about her. And because my parents were all radicals, you know, when they were young. And I've been raised that way. So I'm calling my aunt. I want somebody sturdy, yeah? And I tell her what's happened to Jenny, my daughter. And my aunt said to me on the telephone, "Well, Judy," she said, "you have to understand, children really are sexual from birth." She said, "It isn't that she necessarily wanted, but then again, they do want these things. And so she would have projected it, and he would have picked up on that, and that would have encouraged, you know, what took place. But don't worry about it. There's no problem. She'll be over it in no time. So long as you don't get excited," she said. Okay? I said, "No, that's not right." I knew that, you know. She did not want this. And no, they're not sexual from birth. And thank you very much. And I hung up the phone, right? And now I'm more traumatized. So now I pick up the phone. I'm going to call Carol. So I call my friend in Berkeley, California, Carol, who's had a couple of marriages, and she's had a wilder life than I ever had as a kid. I mean, I'm going to call Carol now. I didn't like the response I got for here. I'm going to go to this one. So I call Carol. I tell Carol what happened. And Carol says, "Well," she says, you have to know, Judy, you know, children are sexual from birth." And she was probably putting out little, you know, vibes or something that he kind of picked up on. And she says, "And just so long as you don't get hysterical, and so long as you don't get all bent out of shape, there'll be no problem. She'll get over it in no time," right? Well, this kid had been suffering for a whole year. But anyway, all right. And I say, "Carol, what did you say?" And she repeats it. And I said, "Thank you, dear, but that's not what she went through. That's not her. They aren't sexual from birth. And I love you. Goodbye." And I hang up the phone, and I think to myself, this is a party line. I mean, I've been a political kid all my life. I know a party line when I hear one. I know a party. That is a party line. There is Maryland traditional over here, Berkeley weird over there, and they're all talking the same talk, walking the same walk, as though they are reading from an existing script. Hugh Hefner, like most guys, was a virgin when he was in college. He had been saving himself for his fiancée. Yeah? He read Kinsey and believed what he read, that everybody was really shacking up with everybody else, that we were a bunch of sexual adventurers, our parents and our grandparents. But they were hypocrites. That was the big word, the big H, hypocrites. The point for Hefner was, and for everybody really, but for Hefner in particular, I think in a way, was that Kinsey claimed that he proved scientifically, of course. And remember, we dropped the H-bomb, so we were in love with science. The bomb saved the world, right? So Kinsey claimed that our parents and our grandparents were doing all these salacious things, but there was no downside to it. In other words, we didn't have any venereal disease, really. We didn't have any rape. He said there was no rape. He said there was no child sexual abuse. He said there was no sex crime, really. There was no abortion. We were fine. So it was paradise here. We were carrying on sexually doing all these things, but there was never any real consequence to it. And he believed that if he did this magazine as Kinsey's pamphleteer and helped people not to be hypocrites, but to admit openly that they were engaged in adultery, and they were engaged in premarital sex, and they were engaged in all this activity, that we would have paradise. This country would just be paradise. Yeah, his intentions were absolutely to change the morality of the consumer. There was no question about that. But let me rephrase that and say, he didn't necessarily know he was changing their morality because he believed Kinsey. Hafner realized he had worked for Esquire before. And Hafner said, I'm going to step into this. I am going to produce a magazine that is going to sell a new lifestyle. It's going to be the male inside the house. It's going to show penthouse stuff. He would be selling a lifestyle. It's what kind of man reads Playboy was the big advertisement. So Hafner created a magazine in which the girl seductively posed, talked about how she loves to be nude. Oh my goodness, it's just her dream to be nude here, to give herself to you. I'm your paper doll, you know. You can have all the sex that you want, and don't worry about it, because it never has a bad result. And that's how he structured that magazine. And so every aspect of that magazine reflects that theme. That's the other big piece of pornography. Pornography is always really intimate, private space conduct in a public forum. And that is what all pornography always is. It's always putting the performer, the exhibitor. This is voyeurism and exhibitionism, which used to be understood as dysfunctional. You're putting that performer in a tremendously risky place. Those young women, when they leave Playboy magazine, Marilyn Monroe talked about it. She says people feel that they can say anything to you of any nature that they want, as though you're their property. Erototoxin is essentially the toxic form of Eros. Eros is a strong, passionate experience that one would have that hopefully leads to good things, that hopefully leads to a man and a woman mating and marrying and bearing children and trusting each other for lifelong and nobody getting a sexual disease from anybody else. And an erototoxin is the alternative to that. And what it does is it abuses the body in a toxic manner, using Eros to cause that. We become toxic to ourselves. So pornography is an erototoxin. It is toxic to the individual, and it's toxic to the body politic. This was not what our world was like. Americans didn't come from that kind of a mindset. We're running from boredom. We're running from. And it used to be that when I grew up, we were running to. We're looking at buying into a lifestyle that is completely alien to true happiness, completely alien to true happiness being contentment. It's the focus on the narcissistic personality, which denies the larger personality. It denies what we're trying to become as human beings. But we've been told, around us, that we have to live this roller coaster life. Well, we don't have to. And we don't have to be entertained every minute of the day. And we can find joy. Look at Mother Teresa. This was not a bored person. Oh, we can't all be Mother Teresa. But we seek to be a great person, exactly. And in seeking to be a great person, that is time. That is work. But it's joyful work.